Ladies and gentlemen, Binnall of America!
And now, ladies and gentlemen, your host, Tim Binnall.
No commercials, no subscriptions, no network, no rules, and at the end of the day, my friends, no comparison. Welcome back to another edition of BOA The Revival. Should be a very interesting episode tonight. Our guest actually came to us recommended by former Binnall of America writer Richard Thomas, who has been in contact with Dustin here for a while, and he said, hey, you should check out Dustin Severs' stuff, check out his book, and have him on the show. And so here we go. It's all come together like that. He is the author of The Abominable Snowman of California, Giant Footprints, let me get it here, Wooden Stompers, and the Making of an American Legend. And I like to show the guests that I do have the book. So, I've done my best to be on top of this. Welcome to the show, Dustin. It's great to have you here.
Hey, Tim. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure, man. So we always start out when we have a first-time guest, the bio, the background. Who is Dustin Severs, and how did you end up writing this book?
Sure, yeah. So Dustin Severs, he lives in Southern Oregon. I live in a little town called Ashland. It's about 10 miles north of the California-Oregon border. And my home, where I'm sitting right now, sits on the foothills of the Klamath-Siskiyou Mountains, which is the same mountain range which contains Bluff Creek, which is the maternity ward for the Bigfoot legend that started back in the 1950s, which is the basis of my book. Patterson-Gimlin film, which is in Bluff Creek, is about 70 miles as the crow flies from my home. But it takes a good 3 hours to drive there, and I go there often. I was there in just a couple months ago. So I go a couple times a year to visit the area. And as far as my interest in Bigfoot, pretty conventional. So I was born in 1979. I always say the 70s was the golden age of Bigfoot and a lot of paranormal activities, that subject generally. So I was born in 79, so I was a child of the 80s. However, I did watch all those cheesy yet awesome documentaries on Bigfoot. So I grew up watching those. My brothers, they're about a decade older than me, so they were kids of the 1970s, so they were Bigfoot fanatics as well. So yeah, I always loved Bigfoot, and as I got, I've always had aspirations for writing a book. So I actually moved here in 2016, and that's really reinvigorated my interest in Bigfoot. I've always been a bit of a history buff, so I love origin stories. So that's really what motivated me to really start doing research on the Bigfoot, particularly the origin story of Bigfoot, how it all started in American popular culture. And I was shocked that there wasn't a book, a comprehensive book, which really covered the people and personalities, which I think is the most fascinating thing about this legend. And so I said I was trying to write the book myself. So it was quite an undertaking, very ambitious, and it took me about 7 years to write the thing, but it came out last year in October. So, yeah.
Nice.
Here I am.
Nice. All right. Yeah, I was born in 79 also, so we're of the same age.
Gen X, we're the best. I dedicated the book to Gen X.
There you go. All right. So that's very interesting. So I got the impression coming out of the book that you were not necessarily a Bigfoot believer, if you will. That you say you're more interested in the personalities. That's obviously captured in the book. The characters that kind of made the Bigfoot legend what it is. So you're not necessarily. What's your take in general on Bigfoot?
I'm absolutely a non-believer. I'm a skeptic, but always caution that I'm not an evangelical skeptic. I don't have an axe to grind with that Bigfoot community. I'm not out to dissuade people. Actually, I hope the Bigfoot legend stays intact forever. I hope nothing. I don't know how it could possibly be proven Bigfoot not to be a reality, but if that were possible, I hope it doesn't happen because I do love the legends. But yeah, my interest is not from a a biological or scientific standpoint. My eyes really glaze over when people get into the whole debate on whether or not Bigfoot exists. I'm bored to tears with it. My interest is more from a historical standpoint, like Bigfoot in American popular culture, and particularly the cast of characters, the original fraternity from the 1950s and 60s. I mean, to me, any great story is all about interesting, colorful characters. You couldn't ask for a better cast of characters than these guys that I write about in the book. And again, I was shocked that no one had ever really done. There's been a few books that kind of wrote a little bit about these guys. It was never a deep dive. So that was really my motivation. My goal was to write the most comprehensive book ever about the Bigfoot origin story, basically from the time I call it the classic period. So the Bigfoot, like I said, the golden age of Bigfoot started with the Patterson-Gimlin film of 1967, and Bigfoot blew up in the 1970s. Bigfoot became a household name in the 1970s. But the period that's often overlooked is that 9 years before the Patterson film, which is 1958 to 1967. So that's what my book focuses on. I call it the classic period. So that's when the Bigfoot legend started in October 5th, 1958 in Eureka, California. And at the time, it was all about, it wasn't about this film in Kodachrome color. It was about these black and white images of these giant and inexplicable tracks that these guys were coming across. And it's just amazing story.
Right. Yeah, I'm kind of, I'm sort of like the guy from X-Files there. Like, I want to believe that the Bigfoot is real, but it's like, it gets harder and harder as time goes by. No, I'm in the same boat. I always say, I hope to God I'm wrong. Even if I look like a real asshole, and if Bigfoot is proven to be a reality, given the book that I wrote, I'm happy I'm happy if that happens. Yeah, and especially like when you look at the history as you've detailed in the book, like if you really kind of take a critical look at it, it's kind of like, okay, look, they found these footprints, and it just kind of doesn't add up necessarily. Like, it just kind of caused this sensation. I guess part of me wants to jump first to the Abominable Snowman, because that seems like that's the precursor to what set the stage for what happened in 58.
Yep.
So talk a little bit about that, which I really found fascinating, because I had never really, learned very much about it till I had checked out your book. This was like in the early 50s. They hadn't conquered Everest yet. They were trying to. And then like along the way, they find these weird footprints. And that's kind of the first time this idea, I guess it had happened. I think you mentioned in the book, it had happened like 30 years earlier, the same kind of circumstances, someone on Everest but it didn't quite really capture the imagination of the public until that early 50s in the Western world, when they found these footprints during the quest to conquer Everest, right?
Yeah. So the title says it all. So the Abominable Snowman of California. So one of the things that changed after 1967, the Patterson film, is that Bigfoot ended up becoming kind of the catch-all generic term for all these cryptic hominoids. Before that, however, you called these things Abominable Snowman. So that's why people kind of derisively referred to Bigfoot when they first heard about it in 1958 as the Abominable Snowman of California, kind of poking fun at it. On its face, it does sound absurd that there would be an abominable snowman in sunny California. So yeah, the Bigfoot and the Abominable Snowman are inextricably linked. So the Abominable Snowman, the legend of the Himalaya, is alternatively called the Yeti. It started in 1921. So Irish man named Charles Howard Bury led the very first expedition in Everest. It was actually a reconnaissance. They explored the northern side back at that time on the Tibetan side. And George Mallory, a famous climber who died a couple years later, he was a part of this reconnaissance mission. And they came across tracks, these inexplicable tracks. And when they came down from the mountain, a British writer named Henry Newman, who was based out of Calcutta, he spoke to them, and they told him about the tracks. He spoke to the Sherpas, and he kind of mistranslated. It may have been intentionally modified the name. They called it the Abominable Snowman. So that's when the Abominable Snowman kind of entered Western popular culture, was in 1921, but really didn't make any waves until 30 years later on another reconnaissance mission of Everest. This one was explored it was the first exploration on the south side from the Nepalese side. It was led by a man known as Mr. Everest, Eric Shipton, who was the most famous mountaineer in the world. Also on that expedition was Edmund Hillary, who 2 years later would be the man who conquered Everest along with Tenzing Norgay. So they also came across tracks, and unlike the Bury expedition 30 years earlier, they had a camera. So they snapped some photos. A few months later, they got in the newspapers, and it went viral. And this is a very similar process that would happen to Bigfoot. So I always say the holy trinity of cryptid hominoids is the Abominable Snowman of the Himalaya, or the Yeti, the Sasquatch of British Columbia fame, and of course Bigfoot of Northern California, USA.
Right. Yeah. That's
they're all linked, and and the Sasquatch and the Yeti were the precursors to Bigfoot. So one could argue that Bigfoot was an appropriation or a ripoff of the Abominable Snowman, because after the 1951 expedition, there's a lot of movies made in Hollywood about the Abominable Snowman, namely the Abominable Snowman, The Himalayas, which is a British movie, which was released almost exactly 1 year before Jerry Cruz stumbled across his tracks, which led to Bigfoot. So I think you can definitely draw a line between the Abominable Snowman and Bigfoot. It's kind of hard to make the argument that it wasn't impacted by the Abominable Snowman in popular culture throughout the 1950s. And the 50s was a golden age of monster movies.
Yeah, you certainly make that case, and it stands to reason. Sort of like I said, if you look at it from a distance, from a macro level, it's like, okay, so this thing happens in the early 50s. They find, they think they discover whatever, the Abominable Snowman comes to light, enters the zeitgeist, if you will. Then, of course, it sort of flows naturally. It becomes a pop culture kind of thing. And then, lo and behold, all of a sudden, there's these prints that are found in California. It's like, kind of makes you think that maybe someone was seeing these movies and shit and reading these stories or whatever and was like, I'm going to make it look like there's one of these things running around here.
Well, yeah, I would argue that it was almost inevitable that there would be a American version of the Abominable Snowman, particularly given the popularity of at the time. And I think Bluff Creek, California was the ideal location for our own American version of the Yeti. And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah. Well, you make the point in the book that it's like that whole area is super remote and would be where you would expect such a creature to live if it did. There are many places you could really put a giant bipedal ape in America that it would live okay.
And post-war America, the Klamath-Siskiyou Mountains of Northern California. Of course, people think of California, think of sunny beaches, but it's extremely varied environments. Some of the most rugged places in the lower 48 is the Klamath-Siskiyou Mountains, even to this day. But it's really the last place, and in Alaska wasn't admitted to the Union until 1959, so we're discounting out Alaska when we talk about 1958. So it really was the final frontier. We really never had the technology to log such steep mountainsides until after the war. We had more advanced chainsaws, trucks, and also a process called high lead logging, which was the use of cables, which allowed them to commercially log these steep mountainsides and these V canyons. So really, it's like on its face, Bigfoot in California sounds absurd, but when you really analyze it, in the 1950s, this would be the most logical. If these animals did exist, this would probably be the most logical place that they would live.
Yeah. Now take us through how this all started, in a sense, with the discovery, initially of these prints. It's really interesting. It's kind of like it's not just that the prints get laid down, it's also that they get picked up by the media, and then that kind of like kicks it all. Like if the guy had never written a story, you mentioned in the book, like he kind of just threw the story in to fill copy at the end of the day, like because he needed like one last thing to put in the paper. Like if it was very serendipitous in a sense that it caused a sensation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we had really starts after World War II with the housing boom. So we have this huge demand for timber. So they started to, for the first time, commercially logging the Klamath-Siskiyou Mountains, and they were going to build a road, Bluff Creek Road, which connects Highway 96 to the south to Highway 199 to the north. And they hired a company or subcontract with a company called Wallace Brothers Construction. These were 4 brothers from Washington State. Their names were Lester. You had Lester, Leslie, Ray Wallace, and Wilbur Shorty Wallace. So they were high-lead loggers. So for a few years, they were logging there. The 2 older brothers, Lester and Leslie, were logging to the south in Mad River, and Ray and Shorty were responsible for overseeing the operations in Bluff Creek for the Bluff Creek Road. So, and one of their loggers, a cat skinner, a very religious man named Jerry Crew, a local man from Sawyer, he came across tracks in August of 1958. So fast forward to September. I should also explain the man who's responsible for coining the name. And his name was Andrew Gonzalez. So he was a regional editor of the local paper there known as the Humboldt Times, based out of Eureka, California. That's located in the Redwood Coast along Northern California. So he was a regional editor, but he's also kind of the de facto historian for Humboldt. He was a man everybody went to about historical questions. He often received what he called Dear Andy letters from his many readers. So in September, he received a letter from a woman named Coralie Bemis. Her husband, his name was, I forget his name all of a sudden. He was also a cat skinner working for the Wallace Brothers Construction up in Bluff Creek. And she says, hey, they're coming across these giant tracks. Have you ever heard of anything about of large tracks like this? Have you ever heard of a wild man in Bluff Creek? So Andrew Rizzoli ended up writing an article about it. He kind of poked fun at it, but it ended up being very serious for many people in the area. So one of his stringer reporters based out of Willow Creek, California, a pleasantly plump woman named Betty Allen. She's one of the unsung heroes of the Bigfoot legend. So she was the first one to really start investigating. She started speaking to many of the locals. She spoke to the loggers. She knew everybody. Everybody loved Betty. She was not native, contrary to what a lot of writers have written in the past. But she had a great relationship with the local Hoopa. So she spoke with them, and she wrote a letter to Andrew, who was her boss, Mr. Gonzalez, and she said, hey, this is very interesting, I wish somebody would make a plaster cast footprint of one of these things. So Andrew Gonzalez ended up printing part of that letter in his article, known as RTD, and it was read by Jerry Crew, who is one of the guys who came across several of these tracks, and he was he led the youth group for his church. And Betty Allen was also she was a member of another church, but she's also involved in the youth program, so they knew each other very well. So he gives Betty a call. Actually, he goes over to Betty's house, and he actually traced one of the tracks onto a piece of paper, and he shows it to Betty. He said, hey, you give this to Andrew Gonzalez. And she said, no problem. And she said, hey, I would love for you to plaster cast footprint of one of these. And Jerry Crew said, okay, I'll do that. So from there, he drove to Redding, California, and spoke to an old friend of his named Bob Titmus, who ends up being one of the famous names in the Bigfoot legend. And he's a local taxidermist. He has a taxidermy shop there in Redding or the Anderson area. Jerry Crew explains the situation to it, and he's initially skeptical, but he does he gives him plaster cast. He tells him how to lay the plaster. Fast forward a couple of days, Jerry Crew gives Betty Allen a call. Say, hey, the footprints have showed back up. You should come up and check it out. So Betty makes her maiden voyage up to Bluff Creek. She ends up writing all about it. And 2 days later, Jerry Crew takes one of those plaster cast footprints to the Eureka Times news office, talks to Andrew Gonzalez. Andrew Gonzalez takes his picture, and the next morning, the Sunday edition of the Humboldt Times, Jerry Crew's picture is on the front page, and Andrew Gonzalez writes a full article. He uses the term Bigfoot for the first time, even though he did not join the two words. He did not capitalize it as a proper noun. That came later. And one of his colleagues, a guy named I'm drawing a blank on his name.
It's all right.
So he had him. He put it on the AP, the Associated Press, and the next day it went viral. So it was printed in papers across the country, and the Bigfoot legend started October 5th, 1958. And when I say start, I'm saying specifically how as largely recognized in American popular culture. A lot of people will gag. A lot of the Bigfoot true believers will gag when I say Bigfoot started in 1958. So I'm specifically saying it started in American popular culture in 1958.
Yeah. I totally get what you're saying. Yeah, because there are stories of Native American legends and stuff like that people connect to the Bigfoot. But as far as Bigfoot, the character that we know and love as Bigfoot, he kind of first came onto the scene by way of this story that you're telling. I mean, that's when they came up with the fucking name Bigfoot. So it's kind of, that's where you trace it all the way back. It's interesting. We've talked about the connection, but it's really interesting the parallels too, in a way, where it's like what really lit the fuse for the Abominable Snowman was the photos of the prints. And then you kind of look at the Bigfoot story, and then you have the same sort of thing where it's like the story was kind of picking up steam, but then once you had that picture of the plaster cast print, then it was like, boom, we're off to the races. Now it's really it's like seeing is believing almost, in a sense.
Yeah, at the time. So after the Patterson film, like I said, the crown jewel of evidence is obviously the Patterson film. Was all about film, and everybody's all about catching stuff on film. But during the classic period, again, it was the evidence was all about these giant tracks and these black and white image of tracks. Same thing with Eric Shipton's Yeti tracks in 1951. So yeah, that was really another one of the major shifts after the 67 film is the evidence shifted from a focus on tracks to the focus on film. Yeah.
Now, while this was, so they're finding these prints and everything. I almost don't like. Well, you kind of like you kind of spoil the ending in a way in the book at the beginning of the book. So I guess we could just do here. Ray Wallace. When he dies, I don't have it in front of me what year he dies. I'm sure you know this.
2002.
2002. That's when this kind of like all comes to light, because his family was like, yeah, he's the one that was doing this shit in the 50s, and we have the stompers to prove it. We have the things. Like if they had just told the story, it'd be like, all right, you're trying to get a little rub on your relative Ray here now that he's passed away. You want to kind of, but it's like, oh shit, they have the stompers too. This is pretty, and I presume this is accurate, right? This is truly what happened. He died and his family came out and they were like, and here are the things that he used, right?
Yeah, I believe it was December 2002 he died, and after he died, it was released in the Seattle Times. And yeah, his family did claim that he was the one responsible. Obviously, again, Ray Wallace is one of the brothers of the Wallace Brothers construction. Right. And yeah, so they claim that he faked the tracks. Of course, like you said, that means nothing. These are just words. And then they provided the evidence. They showed wooden stompers. And of course, anybody can make wooden stompers, but these wooden stompers were identical to the most prominent tracks at the time, which we call the double ball tracks, which were first found by Bob Titmus in November 1959. So that was pretty shocking. Now, I should point out the counter argument, and this was principally made by John Green, which is probably one of the most famous names in Bigfoot Sasquatch history. So after it came out, he argued that means nothing. He kind of made the chicken versus the egg argument. So it was a fact that in 1958 and 1959, Bob Titmus and Jerry Crew were selling fiberglass replicas of those double ball tracks. Not only the double ball tracks, but also the original Bigfoot track that Jerry Crew showed in the picture, which was not the double ball track. Yeah. So he argued that people just simply made stompers out of those replicas, which were pretty prevalent at the time. So that's your basic argument. Who you want to believe?
Yeah. People can't see, but I'm kind of like throwing up my hands where it's like, yeah, I mean, I suppose it really could go either way, right? If they were like really, I wouldn't say mass producing, but certainly creating a lot of copies of this thing, certainly people could it seems almost reasonable, like believable or expected that someone would go out and fuck around and make fake tracks using the prints if they had them. So it's tough to really, But the fact that, it's really, to me, it was like, I heard that story about Ray Wallace in the past, but ironically, you don't hear it very often from Bigfoot people. That's been kind of like I would assume that they would say that it's case closed. That the time, as you mentioned, the timeline thing and all that. This is why it's bullshit. But to me, it's like that's pretty compelling evidence that this thing might have been a big hoax from the start.
It is compelling evidence, but it's a compelling counter argument by John Green. So I don't think the case is closed, and I wouldn't have it any other way.
No, absolutely not. No. Right. Because now Bigfoot's like fucking everywhere, and people. I mean, you hear stories about people seeing it. Now, were people reporting at the time when first they're finding these prints? Were people actually saying that they had seen this thing?
After October 58 or before?
Like when it took off.
Not a lot. Yeah, eventually you start getting people, but very few sightings. Almost all about tracks. You were finding up there. Very, very few sightings, but we have it on October 12th. As I wrote in the book, I wrote a chapter when in October of 1958 it blew up in the newspaper. Every day they were printing different stories about Bigfoot. So I think the first sighting was made by a couple of loggers on October 12th. They were the first to claim that they actually saw Bigfoot. Besides that, it was just people constantly finding tracks.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. So, it's even more suspect in a way. Because it's not like someone had... If someone had seen the fucking thing first, and then you see the prints, that to me makes a little more... But to me, it's like, okay, you're just finding prints. This doesn't really make any... This doesn't really add up, in my... Like, it makes your version of events is very compelling. So it's like, okay, this is a... This is worrisome as a Bigfoot fan. So what happens after when this craze happens? Now we have people in the woods looking for this thing, right?
Yeah. So I say initially after that, Bigfoot kind of had his 15 minutes of fame. He got some national attention, but I always say, like, again, I keep having to go back to that big paradigm shift in the Bigfoot legend that occurred with the Patterson film in 1967. So when the Patterson film was first released in Argosy magazine, where they first showed the images and told the story, a story told by Ivan Sanderson, at that time, probably a small minority of people have ever heard of Bigfoot. But however, like I said, 1970 is when Bigfoot really blew up in American popular culture. The Patterson film was seen by millions and millions. I mean, literally probably 150, 60, 70 million people. You show something on network TV in the 1970s, it was seen by 50, 60 million people on a prime slot on network televisions before cable, before the internet, obviously. So by the time Ronald Reagan took the oath of office in 1981, everybody in the country knew who Bigfoot was. So going back, but again, after the Andrew Gonzalez's article in October of 1958, he kind of had his 15 minutes of fame in October. But you're right. After that brought in what I call the Bigfoot vanguard, the outsiders. You had the local Humboldt fraternity. You have Bob Titmus, Jerry Crew, Betty Allen, and Andrew Gonzalez. But then after the Bigfoot went on AP Wire, it caught the attention of some other people involved in the Abominable Snowman and Sasquatch, and these are what I call the Bigfoot vanguard. That consists of Renee DeHenden and John Green. They were two Sasquatch hunters. And you had the two Yeti hunters, which were Tom Slick and Peter Byrne. And you have Ivan T. Sanderson, who, along with a guy named Bernard Holmans, was considered the godfather of cryptozoology. So after that, Tom Slick, a multimillionaire from San Antonio, Texas. So in the 1950s, he had financed 3 expeditions searching for the Yeti in the Himalaya. And then after the Jerry Crew story, he shifted his focus to Bigfoot in Northern California. So from the years 1959 to 1962, he had 2 expeditions going on. He had one in Bluff Creek searching for Bigfoot called the Pacific Northwest Expedition. And he also had a second expedition going on up in British Columbia searching for the Sasquatch. So Peter Byrne was principally responsible for Bluff Creek. And up north, it was principally Bob Titmus who was in charge, but he was also assisted by John Green on occasion. Tragically, Tom Slick died in October of 1962, which cut out all the funding. So that kind of brought on what I call the quiet, or actually what John Green called the quiet period in Bigfoot history, which was 1962 to 1967. And then when the Patterson film came out, and the story after that, and Bigfoot really blew up. But it was, I should go back, and so the article in the Humboldt Times from '58, that was big. But what was even much bigger, which introduced Bigfoot to millions of people, was December 1959 when Ivan T. Sanderson wrote an article about Bigfoot and Jerry Crew, which was featured in True magazine. And this was a time when magazines were, major publications like True, these men adventure magazines were read by millions. So Ivan T. Sanderson is one of the central characters in the history of Bigfoot. Not only did he introduce Bigfoot to much of the world in 1959, he was also the guy who wrote the first article about the Patterson-Gimlin film in 1967.
Yeah, he's a titan. He's like your first ballot Hall of Fame guys. He's the foundation of a lot of this. One guy who, well, actually, I got a couple questions here. So let me jump back. We've talked about sort of the origins of the Abominable Snowman, and now what seems to be the origins of Bigfoot. Now, what about Sasquatch? You say you kind of listed that as how did this all kind of enter the zeitgeist? Did Sasquatch just kind of where in the timeline is this? Does this come along between the Abominable Snowman and Bigfoot, after Bigfoot? Like, where is Sasquatch in this chain of events? Yeah,
so like I said, the 2 precursors of Bigfoot is the Abominable Snowman and the Sasquatch. The Sasquatch actually started around the same time as the Abominable Snowman. If you trace the exact time, its coming out party is equivalent to the October 5th, 1958 article for Bigfoot. Was an article that was released on April 1st, oddly enough, 1929, in the Maclean's magazine. It was written by the father of the Sasquatch, known as a guy named J.W. Burns. So he was of Irish birth. He came over in the boat. He was a newsman. He ended up taking over as he headed up the Indian agent, they called him at the time, of the Chehalis Indian Reserve of the First Nations people there in southern British Columbia, right outside of Vancouver. So they're ones who told him about the Sasquatch. And the interesting thing about the Sasquatch, I talk about, there's another thing that changed with the Patterson-Gimlin film. After the Patterson-Gimlin film, Bigfoot is generally thought of as essentially an ape, kind of like a gorilla on human legs. Yeah. Before that, during the classic period, with Bigfoot and particularly the Sasquatch, they were considered more wild men than apes. Right. But it was John Green who always argued that they were actually apes. So he was somewhat vindicated when the Patterson-Gimlin film came out.
Interesting.
So J.W. Burns, he got to know the Chehalis Indians very well, and they told him about the Sasquatch legend. He's the one who coined the term Sasquatch. He is a hacking of its actual name, but it has stuck for 100 years now. I guess it is exactly, because he came in 1924. He came to British Columbia as the Indian agent. So it's been 100 years now. So he's the one who really popularized the Sasquatch. He was a writer. He wrote tons of articles in the newspaper and popular magazines at the time. He also orchestrated the 1959 Sasquatch Days, which was also received a lot of attention. But the Sasquatch, it kind of died after during World War II and after, and it was rejuvenated in the late 1950s with the arrival of a very cranky Swissman named Rene de Hinden when he came to town, and him and John Green got together, and so there's the centennial celebration of British Columbia was in 1957. So the provincial government financed different celebrations for different communities. And Harrison Hot Springs, where John Green and Rene Hinden, generally where they lived, they wanted to do a Sasquatch hunt. It was actually headed by Rene Hinden. It did come to fruition, but it did receive a lot of attention. Now, as far as if that centennial celebration of 57 influenced Bigfoot the next year, I would think it would have to have. I couldn't find any newspapers in America that really reported on. But however, I mean, Vancouver is just across the border in Canada, so I would think that the Sasquatch had as much impact. The popularity of the Sasquatch in 1957 had as much impact as the movies on the Yeti throughout the 50s.
Yeah, that would make sense. Yeah. I mean, you would just, it stands to reason somehow where it's not that far apart, even though it was back then. So it's like, somehow I think it would kind of like filter into the localized regional zeitgeist of the time. Talk about Renee Hinden. He's like my favorite old school Bigfoot character. If they ever make if ever someone from that era would be good for a biopic, I feel like he would. Although the whole period could be like a Mad Men style TV show. But Renee Hinden, I just always hear these crazy stories about him, and he's just this real odd character in a sense. Yeah,
like I said, there's the whole Vanguard. There's such a great cast of characters, but I think none of them are more colorful than Renee Hinden. And I think he's everybody's favorite. He's just he's a Swissman. He came to America in 1953 from Switzerland. I mean, the most endearing quality about him was his voice. He had this very thick German accent, but he also had a speech impediment. So he struggled with his R's. Those tracks are called twacks. And he was a very, very cranky man, which is a total contrast to the guy he's associated with in Bigfoot history, John Green, who was a very sober man. So Renee Hinden came to British Columbia in he came to Canada in 1953, and that's when he heard about the Daily Mail expedition in the Himalaya to search for the Yeti. So that's what inspired him. Actually, the guy he was working for said, "Hey, you don't need to go to the Himalaya to see these things. They got them in British Columbia." So he ended up moving to British Columbia, and that's really where his lifelong obsession with the Sasquatch began. And what a lot of people don't know is to this day, Renee Hinden's family owns the Patterson-Gimlin film.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that. Mm-hmm. Jeez. Well.
So I don't talk about it in this book, but I'm writing a follow up book which really focuses on the 1970s and the Patterson-Gimlin film. That's where I would really cover. So Renee Hinden's obsession. He was absolutely obsessed with proving that the Sasquatch were real and Bigfoot, which are one and the same. But eventually in the 1970s, with the popularity of the Bigfoot and the popularity of the Patterson-Gimlin film, he really shifted his obsession to obtaining the rights and the ownership of the Patterson-Gimlin film. I think he got to the point where, you know what, there's no way I'm never going to find this thing. So the best I can come to claiming Bigfoot is to acquire the Patterson-Gimlin film. So he did that through legal squabbles for a whole decade. So he owned the Patterson-Gimlin film. He also owns Roger Patterson's book. And then when he died in 2001, his two sons, Eric and Martin, are actually the owners of the Patterson-Gimlin film. I actually own half of it. They own the Patty Patterson, Roger Patterson's widow, who's still alive. She owns the television rights, and they own the rest.
Oh, weird. Interesting. Yeah, I never even really thought about who owns it because it's like so prolific. I mean, I don't
think they make any money on it. It's impossible.
I go on YouTube right now and watch it. Yeah, so it's like they're not really. But I suppose if if I was making a TV show, I want to run the movie. Yeah, it would make sense. Someone, in the legal department would be like, these people actually own it. We can't broadcast the Patterson-Gimlin movie. So yeah, it kind of makes sense in that regard. I would assume. You might get in some trouble if you had a TV show and you ran it. Yeah,
I think the legalities, I think they've kind of given up on it with the prevalence with the internet. It's impossible. I don't think that the Hindens or Patricia Patterson even try to make money off of it anymore, to my knowledge.
Right. Yeah.
But the Patterson-Gimlin film had the reputation unofficially as being the most watched amateur film in history, second only to the Zapruder film. which didn't come out till it was a JFK assassination, but it didn't come out till I think 1976. But anyway, and there's no proof of this, but it was most certainly true. I mean, with the internet, obviously, it was no longer the case. There's probably cat videos that has more views than it. But during the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, it likely was the most watched amateur film in history. The reason being that it was shown on network television several times. And if you have if you have a network show in the 1970s, it wasn't unusual to have Super Bowl level ratings. You're talking 50, 60, 70 million people watch it. So there's no telling how many people actually saw the Patterson film in the 1970s. And that's really what created Bigfoot, made it a household name.
Yeah. It's interesting because I remember talking to Lauren Coleman a few years ago about this, about how, because people listening now in 2024, it's hard to even imagine initially, and maybe you can speak to this too, like the movie at first didn't get was shown like as part of some nature movie in the movie theaters, right? And it was like, if you were into Bigfoot back then, you had to fucking go to the movies, dude, and buy a ticket and sit there through how long the wildlife movie was, to see the clip of the Bigfoot. And then, like, I can only imagine how, like, I don't know, frustrating, maddening, also kind of titillating it must be, where it's like, there it goes. That was the thing, the clip. That was the Bigfoot movie. And then it's like, well, you want to see it again, you got to buy a ticket for the 5 o'clock showing of the wildlife movie. It was that hard to, it was almost as elusive as the Bigfoot itself at first when it came out, right?
Yeah, it didn't blow up as quick as the 1958 picture of Jerry Curry. It took a few years. So it wasn't until the mid 70s when Bigfoot really blew up, and every time it was shown on network television through one of the several documentaries or some of the movies that came out, they would always show the Patterson-Gimlin film, and then it was basically seen by everybody. You also have to consider the fact that this was before they had high definition, before they stabilized the film, so it wasn't as that's I must say that the Patterson-Gimlin film, even with modern technology, when you really zoom in on it and stabilize the film, it's still pretty impressive.
Yeah, I mean, for as skeptical as your work made me about the 50s era stuff, I'm still a believer in the Patterson. I can't quite find the hole in the whole thing. But I do think that if there is, with all due respect to Bob Gimlin, who's still around, if there's any, you got to look at the people involved. That would probably you'd be able to maybe decipher if it was real or not. But trying to figure it out from the thing in the movie is, it's hard. I mean, I've seen people try to make the case that it's a guy in a suit, but I just don't see it. Yeah.
No, that's the classic debate is still raging on today, and it is probably second only to the Zapruder film, and is just being analyzed, just picked apart and controversial, and I love it.
Yeah. Do you have a theory on how it was made? I assume you're skeptical that it's genuine. So do you have a theory on how it came about?
Yeah, but I don't want to say too much. Like, this is what my next book is all about. Yeah, so the first book, again, covers the 50s, the origin story, and it looks at the spoiler, who is Ray Wallace. And the second book I'm working on, which is almost done, covers the 70s, the Patterson-Gimlin, and it looks at the spoiler, in this case, who is the man named Bob Hieronymus.
All right. Well,
potentially the man who was in the seat. He's a spoiler equivalent to Ray Wallace.
Right, exactly. That's the key to the whole thing. It's like, if you want to prove this is fake, you got to figure out who is in the suit, right? Because who played the role of Bigfoot, and so it's that's kind of the mystery of it. Yeah. Well, you mentioned also Tom Slicky had a mysterious death.
He did. So he died in October 1962. He was flying over Montana, and he's in one of those classic planes from the 1950s and 60s, the same type of plane that Richie Valens and Buddy Holly died in. And I think there's a lot of crashes involved in those type of planes at the time. But yeah, I guess they never really figured out how how it exploded. It was like a mid-air explosion. So there's all these conspiracy theories that have came out since that time. Tom Slick, he was a powerful man, had links to a lot of different powerful people. I don't give much credence to any of the conspiracy theories, but they're fun nonetheless.
Well, when you get into the world of the weird, and then you add in death under unusual circumstances, plane crash, you always get conspiracy theories. I've known people. Yeah. Go ahead.
One talking about conspiracy, I don't feel like this really is a conspiracy theory. One thing I really looked into the book, I was a little frustrated. I can never get the answer. Is whether or not Tom Slick, his expeditions in the Himalaya was being funded, or he was involved with the CIA. I say the chances that he was involved with the CIA is probably 99.9%, but can't find any evidence. So he was given permission to explore the Himalaya right on the Tibetan Nepalese border in Red China. So there's no way he's going to be allowed to do that, not be approached by either the CIA or the British equivalent. And we know for a fact that he had several links to the CIA. The CIA was involved with Slick Airways, and we have actually some letters have been released between him and the CIA. So he was certainly involved with the CIA. So I say the likelihood that he was working with the CIA. I'm not saying that. I'm saying he was genuine. He was genuinely looking for the Yeti in the Himalaya. However, I think he was probably working with the CIA at the same time, just telling them to keep an eye out on things.
Yeah, I think that might have been the case with a lot of people back then.
Well, hundreds, thousands of people were working for the CIA back then. It wasn't that uncommon.
Right. It's like, it's kind of like, what do you even like call working for? You know what I mean? Where it's like, if it's an actor or an actor.
I don't know if they were paying him. I'm sure as a patriot, he'd just say, hey, they probably approached him and say, hey, we're going to be working this area. Keep an eye on this and that. He was also probably working. He was most certainly working for the CIA or the OSS, which was the pre-war equivalent to the CIA during World War II. So he went to Yale. He graduated from Yale, and he volunteered for the Navy right after Pearl Harbor. He was rejected due to poor eyesight, which that's what they always said when they recruited smart guys from Yale. Yale was like a recruiting mill for the OSS during World War II. So they would get denied due to poor eyesight or flat feet, and then they would go in. They would essentially be spies. So that's what Tom Slick was essentially a spy, as was Ivan Sanderson during World War II.
Yeah, and like you're saying, it was just kind of what you did for your country if they wanted. You know, it was a war, for God's sakes. It's people were like willing to do anything. You mentioned Renee DeHinton being cranky. So what do you have sort of any anecdotes here about? Because I remember an old story that he was like, I'm gonna misquote him terribly, but it was something like, I don't fucking need a house, a mortgage, a wife, kids. Even though apparently he did have all those things. He's like, I just want the fucking Bigfoot. I just want the Bigfoot. It was some kind of crazy ass quote like that, where it was like, all right, this dude's my favorite old school Bigfooter. He's off the hook.
Yeah, I compare him to Captain Ahab and Moby Dick. You know, the Sasquatch was his white whale, and he was just absolutely obsessed his whole life with being the man who proved that the Sasquatch was reality. And it did cost him his family. So he did have a family, he had a wife and 2 kids, and his wife in 1966 gave him an ultimatum, said, hey, you have to give up the Sasquatch stuff. It's either your family or the Sasquatch. And he made no bones about it. He said, I'll take the Sasquatch. So he ended up from 1963 to the day he died, he worked. He couldn't have a regular job because he just couldn't take orders from other people. So he had a job at the Vancouver Gun Club, obviously in Vancouver, where he collected shot from the gun range, and he lived in a little Atco trailer. They let him live on rent-free, and he stayed there for the rest of his life. And basically his plan was he collected the lead from the field, and he tried to save up monies to finance from expeditions every year.
Yeah, it's crazy. I was going to ask you, like, what did this guy even do for a living? But you just told me. So yeah, that's talk about. I don't know. I want to say dedication, but that's almost like as you said earlier, obsession. This guy,
Yeah.
It's like people think, I always kind of just thought he was just like, I guess I never really gave it much thought. Like, oh, he's a Bigfoot researcher. Like, okay, so I don't know, maybe he was also had a regular job. I guess but the job was just a means to an end to continue searching for the Bigfoot.
Yeah, and the name Rene DeHenden is entwined historically with that of John Green. Green and DeHenden, they go hand in hand, kind of like Patterson and Gimlin. Even though I would argue that they were really the OGs when it comes to Bigfoot Sasquatch history. I mean, number 1 and 2 is DeHenden and Green, not necessarily in that order, but yeah, they were the OGs, and they were such a contrast. Such a stunning contrast, such diametric personalities. I mean, everything. I mean, DeHenden was cranky and angry, and John Green was a very soft-spoken guy, long, lanky, spoken in a monotone, a consummate intellectual, graduated from Columbia University. DeHenden was anti-intellectual. He despised scientists. Those goddamn PhDs, he used to always say. So it was really shot how these guys coexisted. They coexisted for 10 years before they really started having a falling out, and they kind of they had quite the falling out. And they didn't they corresponded for years. We got really nasty in the 70s, probably in the 80s and 90s. But yeah, they did coexist for 10 years. They were partners in trying to prove that the Sasquatch was reality.
So how did John Green get mixed up in all this? We've done sort of the background on this. So Rene DeHenden. So first of all, Rene DeHenden, he comes to Canada solely on the obsession's already taken hold in him, right?
No.
Oh,
He came in 53 and he got a job on a guy's dairy farm. And that's when he heard there's a radio came on talking about the Daily Mail expedition that was being launched in the Himalaya to search for the Yeti. And that's what sparked his interest. And that's when Wilbur, something like that, the dairy farmer said, hey, you don't have to go to Himalaya to find those. They got those in British Columbia. And that's when he moved to British Columbia. And that's when the obsession started.
Okay, gotcha. See, because you kind of went over that earlier, but I was confused because I thought when the guy said that to him, that's what made him decide to move all the way to Canada. So okay, now I got you. So how did Green get involved in this, and how did these two get together in the first place? Because if they're such contrasting personalities, how you would think that they would repel immediately, but apparently not.
Yeah, so John Green was originally from Vancouver area, and he grew up knowing all about the Sasquatch folklore. He knew about J.W. Burns' story. He was always a skeptic, never believed in the Sasquatch. So he was a newspaper journalist. He started his own newspaper, the Agassiz Advance, in 1954 there in Harrison Hot Springs, which is a little resort town. Harrison Hot Springs is the Bluff Creek of the Sasquatch. That's where the legend started, was that area. So he ran a newspaper there, started in 1954. In 1956 is when he met Rene DeHenden and came to the news offices, tell him stories about the Sasquatch. And oddly, they kind of had a working relationship. And then in 1957 is when the Centennial Sasquatch hunt, when that kind of blew up in the newspapers. Again, that was Rene DeHenden that initiated that. He went to the Harrison Hot Springs City Council and said, hey, we should use this money to do a Sasquatch hunt, which would be great publicity. And it was great publicity for the town. It got national coverage for months on end. So slowly, John Green became a somewhat tepid believer in the Sasquatch. He was a newspaper man, so he reported on the Sasquatch stories, and he heard a couple stories, and eventually he became convinced. And him and Rene DeHenden somehow, some way, they joined forces, and they were Green and DeHenden. Those were the go-to guys when it came to Sasquatch for years to come. And they were focused on the Sasquatch in British Columbia. Then in 1958, the next year is when they heard about Bigfoot, and from then they really shifted their focus to Bigfoot. And they were part of the Slick expeditions of 1959 through 1962. So
yeah. So you mentioned earlier that the Patterson-Gimlin film transformed sort of the vision of Bigfoot, what people think it is. And so when they were going on these expeditions, where they were looking for something different than what we see as Bigfoot today.
Yeah. So at the time, most people, the conventional view was Bigfoot was a wild man. And one person who always argued against that was John Green. He was convinced that it was an ape. He was the first guy to really make that argument. I think slowly Henry came along to that point of view as well. So yeah, they were the Pacific Northwest expedition officially started November 15th, 1959. They had a meeting at Wyatt's Motel in downtown Willow Creek. Renee DeHenden was there. John Green was there. Bob Titmus was there. Betty Allen was there. We know the story because I actually wrote a chapter on it in the book, and I wrote it as literary nonfiction. I wrote it as a scene, but all the information is accurate because Betty Allen, she sat there and wrote everything that happened. She wrote who was there. She wrote what was said. Yeah. So that's where I got all that information from. So then that's when the Pacific Northwest expedition took off. Bob Titmus was the titular leader for like the first year. And then he ended up bringing, he called in the Byrne brothers from the Himalaya because they were running the Yeti expeditions in the Himalaya at the time. He said, hey, I want you to come over there. And Bob Titmus, Green, and Hen actually hated Peter Byrne's guts. So they left the picture. So they end up Titmus and Green ran the British Columbia expedition up in the Great Bear looking for the Sasquatch, which is also financed by Slick, while the Byrne brothers took over in Bluff Creek.
And what are they doing on these expeditions? Like what? Just walking through the wilderness looking for signs of the wild man?
Yeah, so the first year, like I said, Bob Titmus was the leader. So they had what is called brownies, these little Kodak cameras. They actually had trip cameras back in the 50s. So Bob Titmus set up trip cameras all throughout the Bluff Creek watershed. I got some images of a bear. Obviously, no Bigfoot, but no, they were out to kill one. It was very clear that they were there to shoot and kill a Bigfoot when they came across one. That was somewhat controversial.
Oh, wow.
So they discussed that at that initial meeting at White's Motel. Tom Slick made it clear that is my intent to kill one. And John Green was always in the pro kill contingent too. The only one who was really opposed to it was Betty Allen. Was not pleased with killing a Bigfoot. But that was always a big divide amongst the Bigfoot fraternity throughout the 60s and 70s, whether or not you should kill one or not.
It still is the big debate.
And John Green and Grover Krantz were always the big pro kill people. Peter Byrne was pro don't kill. DeHenden was all over the place. Publicly, he would say he was against it, but in his letters, he was always definitely pro kill. So, Roger Patterson didn't want to kill. He was against killing a Bigfoot as well.
Well, yeah. I mean, if they had guns when they made the movie, right?
Yeah. Yeah, they could. Yeah. If it was indeed real,
Yeah. I never even thought of that, but yeah, if that was a genuine encounter, they could have fucking easily shot.
Gimlin had his gun in his hand, his rifle in his hand. He could have shot and killed it if he wanted to. But Roger Patterson, he claims that. He claims that him and Patterson had an agreement before that they wouldn't shoot unless it attacked them, and this one was retreating, moving away from him. At least that's what the story is.
Yeah. That does make me, interesting that they're just walking through the fucking woods. How long were they doing? And camping, I suppose, right? Because this sounds actually kind of awful to me. How long were they doing this for?
Yeah, so they were there for years now. Bob Gimlin's been saying 3 years, but that certainly isn't true. There's Patterson was quoted 2 or 3 times saying they were there for a week. So actually, I can go back, and this actually covers the part of the story. Is what prompted them to come to Bluff Creek was an event that occurred the summer of 1967 over Labor Day weekend. So John Green gets a call that they haven't seen tracks in a few years in Bluff Creek. So he get a call that they have tracks in Bluff Creek. So I'll make a long story short, but him and Renee DeHenden fly down in an airplane along with a tracking dog to see these tracks. And there's literally thousands of tracks. And the tracks are the classic double ball tracks. What would later be renowned as the Wallace tracks. They found thousands of these tracks. They actually knew Roger Patterson at the time. John Green first met him in 1965, and Patterson had written a book in 1966. So they notified Patterson, hey, we got tracks again in Bluff Creek. So that fall, about a month later, the reason why they waited so long is not clear. It doesn't really make sense why they would take so long. But allegedly in October, him and Bob Gimlin drove to Bluff Creek. They were there for approximately a week. Then it was a Friday around 1:30. They allegedly saw the creature and filmed it.
I actually meant something else with that question, but I was so interested in what you were going to tell me that I didn't want to stop you. What my question was on these Tom Slick expeditions.
I see.
To Hendon and John Green and Peter Byrne. No, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah. I'm still trying to wrap my mind around, like, how long are these expeditions that the Slick one put on, and like, what are they doing? What are they just walking through? It's just kind of hard for me to fathom, like, what a Bigfoot. I guess the same thing, these people who go out on the weekends looking for Bigfoot. Yeah,
it was kind of a lot of people kind of make fun of I know John Green and Renee DeHen always look back on the Pacific Northwest expedition and kind of mock it, saying it was a bunch of amateurs and kind of a theater of the absurd throughout the time. But no, they would they would set up the brownie cameras. They would put caches of food in various places. They would walk the roads, walk the streams, hoping to see one. I know when Peter Byrne ended up taking over in 1960, a guy named Mathis, he was a cougar hunter. He was brought in by Slick to help the Byrne brothers out. And he said that they would basically just follow the streams throughout the watershed looking for tracks. And
How long did this go on for? Like, how long?
They pretty much did it continuously. I know Bob Titmus was put in charge of the British Columbia expedition, the Great Bear in British Columbia, and he did it full time. I think I know that the Burns brother, they left he went back to Himalaya, and then he'd come back. So he kind of switched back and forth from doing his big game hunting in Nepal, and then doing the heading up the Pacific Northwest expedition hunting for Bigfoot. But yeah, it went on from the fall of 1952 to 1960. Excuse me, the fall of 1959 to the fall of 1962 were the Slick expeditions.
Wow. And so it's really just like it was continuous. That's wild.
Yeah, and there was no exposure. He kind of had an immediate blackout, and his expeditions in the Himalaya were very publicized. He kind of learned from that, so there's really wasn't a lot written in the newspapers about these Slick expeditions while they were going on. There were occasionally, but he actually had him sign non-disclosure agreements not to talk about it to the press. So there's not a lot of stuff that was written about it at the time.
And what's funny is, if you really think about it, you like this super millionaire guy, he's throwing money at this thing. And it's like, who the fuck is on this team? John Green, who's a newspaper reporter, right? He's not like a wilderness guy or an animal expert or anyone really kind of like remotely qualified to send off into the woods to look for this. And Renee DeHen, who sounds like a vagabond. Like, it doesn't sound like he's a lead collector at a fucking gun range. Like, he's not. It kind of goes back to sort of like a running joke we have in contemporary Bigfoot world, and that's like anyone can call themselves a fucking Bigfoot expert. Yeah. And apparently, these two guys were the Bigfoot Sasquatch experts. But if you look at it, it's like, from what? Because they were the only ones really collecting the information, I suppose.
Yeah, they didn't really have any qualifications. However, Peter Byrne certainly did. Peter Byrne was a professional big game hunter in Nepal, so he did have experience. And probably the most skilled guy was actually Bob Titmus. He had a lot of it. He was an experienced hunter. Apparently, he was a phenomenal tracker, so he did have a lot of outdoors experience. But yeah, you're right. John Green was more of a white collar guy sitting behind a typewriter. DeHen definitely was an outdoor. I don't think anybody spent more time in the bush than Renee DeHen. But I don't know if he really possessed any special skills in terms of hunting or tracking that I'm aware of.
He's just so obsessed with the Bigfoot that it does. He's like those like amoebas that live in the volcanic lava.
Yeah.
He's surviving any conditions. You just drop him in the Himalayas and he's off looking for fucking the Abominable Snowman. So why didn't Peter Byrne get along with these guys to the point they had to like split up the team?
Yeah, it's the interesting thing about the Bigfoot fraternities. You have these unique individuals. They all hated each other. So they all hated Peter Byrne, Bob Titmus, and Renee DeHenden despised each other. That's why DeHenden actually wasn't part of the British Columbia expedition. He wanted to be part of it, but Bob Titmus refused to let him be on it. He told him, Tom Slick, if he's on it, I'm not doing it. And
Wow.
Titmus was the guy. He was the most experienced tracker. As far as Peter Byrne, so Peter Byrne was a guy. He's one of the most famous guys. I mean, if you have, in my opinion, if you created a Mount Rushmore of Bigfooters, it would be Green, DeHenden, Peter Byrne, and Bob Titmus. But Peter Byrne was not respected by his peers, to say the least. He was very unscrupulous with his stories. I won't use the word lie. I won't say he flat out lied, but he was economical with the truth, you might say, similar to Ivan T. Sanderson. So he was I think they despise him, one, because he's a handsome guy. He had the safari outfit. He had the British accent. They just despised the guy since day one. And he's a pretty vainglorious guy. And he got all the attention from the press. I mean, Green and DeHenden were doing all the grunt work, and then Byrne would just show up, and all the cameras and the newsmen they want to talk to the handsome guy with the safari costume on. So he just got all the attention. So they just despised him for decades.
Is he who we have to blame for the proliferation of hats in Bigfoot world? If you don't have a hat, you're not. He kind of had the Indiana Jones get up going. Yeah. Now, what about Bob Titmus? We've kind of done a little character sketch on each of these guys, but we haven't really got into Bob Titmus. So tell me, he's a native? He's from around the area? I think he was.
Yeah. So oddly enough, he's kind of an enigma. So he did not a lot of written about. He never wrote a book, and he hated talking to the press. So he's the one guy when it comes to biographies. And he didn't have children either. So when it comes to biographies, he was the toughest guy to write about because there's not a lot about him. But yeah, oddly enough, him and Jerry Crew were childhood friends. They grew up in Caldwell, Idaho. So he ended up moving to California, and he became he was always a proficient outdoorsman. He's in almost all these guys were in World War II veterans, or most of them were. So he was in the Marines during World War II. He was not. Interesting side note: everybody says even John Green and Bob Titmus were extremely close friends, and Bob Titmus died, I believe, in 1997. So when he read his obituary, it basically stated that he was injured in combat during World War II in Pearl Harbor. And that's not accurate, because I actually pulled Bob Titmus's records, and he actually that's not true. But just an interesting side note. But anyway, yeah, Bob Titmus, he ended up being a taxidermist there in California, and and because of his childhood friendship with Jerry Crew. That's why Jerry Crew came to him to get some instructions on how to make plaster casts for these giant footprints he was finding. And then after that, Bob Titmus ended up being like the most prolific Bigfoot hunter in the area after that.
Interesting. And probably probably the most prominent American one, right? Because John Green, he's Canadian also, as with DeHenden.
Yeah. Like I said,
DeHenden's German, right? So
Titmus isn't the most famous one, like I said, because he's just, like I said, he never wrote books. He didn't talk to the press.
Right.
Yeah.
I get what you're saying.
But amongst the fraternity back then, he was known as the most experienced, the most skilled hunter and tracker. He's a guy who always found tracks. He's the first guy who found the double ball track.
Well, I guess kind of what I was trying to wrap my head around too was just like that. I'm imagining this group, and it's like it's an interesting array of characters, because you've got an American, a Canadian, a German guy who came to Canada, and an American guy. A British guy, Peter Byrne. So it's an interesting, melting pot of.
Sanderson was Scottish American. Yeah, so it's a very international cast.
Now, did they? I presume they were all true believers, right? Was there ever any discussion like, oh, maybe we're fucking barking up the wrong tree? Maybe this is, or were they just dead set that like there is this wild man? And I use wild man because, like you're saying, I'm imagining that they weren't they like when people think Bigfoot, they see it's like that Loch Ness monster. You know, it's like people see the Patterson-Gimlin Bigfoot, and it's like I don't think that they were in their mind's eye that's what this thing looked like. But so they were just sort of sure that there was this wild man running around.
Yeah, I think they're all genuine in their belief. I mean, some of them have questionable character. Obviously, to Hendon, he was an SOB, but at the same time, he was a very, very honest person. He always said he never claimed to see a Sasquatch. He never found a tract on his own. He's very, very vocal about that. So same thing with Peter Byrne. He did find tracks, but he never claimed to see a Sasquatch, Bigfoot, Yeti, and some of them did have Bob Titmus did have some sightings, and he made some questionable claims. I say the guy whose character is beyond reproach is really John Green. He was a really, really good guy, trustworthy guy. He genuinely believed in the Sasquatch were real to the day he died.
Yeah. It's really interesting. Yeah, and they're all gone now, obviously, right? I think Bob.
Yeah, it's a sad. Well, Pete. That's the tough thing about writing the book. They're all long since dead. Actually, Peter Byrne just died almost exactly a year ago. He lived till age 97.
Oh wow!
So I corresponded with him a little bit. But I was uncomfortable trying to interview him because I feel like if you're that age, is not going to be very reliable. He wasn't reliable at any time, so he's certainly not going to be reliable at age 97.
Yeah, I'd be like Hulk Hogan nowadays. He can tell you some real tall tales. Yeah.
Yeah, but no, they are all long since dead. So that's a challenge.
So Tom Slick dies, right? And now no one's paying them to live in the woods anymore. So what do they do?
That's what they said. John Green called it the quiet years, 62 to 67. So not a lot. They kind of made it a side gig for a few years now. Bob Titmus had to get a job. He ran his own taxi service. John Green focused on his newspaper. He's also the mayor of Harrison Hot Springs. And then even Renee Hendon tried to kind of focus on his family and kind of attempt to make the Sasquatch a sidebar, but that didn't work out. That didn't work out. That lasted a couple years, and that's when he left his family. And
Jeez,
yeah, and then Peter Byrne went back to the Himalaya and went back to his after Slick died, he went back to the Himalaya and ran his big game hunting operation in Nepal, and he came back. And after the Patterson-Gimlin film kind of propelled him back into the Bigfoot hunt in the late 60s. And the rivalry started all over again.
Yeah. I want to ask you so much about post Patterson-Gimlin, but this is not.
No, that's fine. No, you can't. No, that's fine. That's fine.
No. It's all right. It's just it was transformative. I mean, it's remarkable to look at where Bigfoot is today. I write about Bigfoot a lot with my job with Coast to Coast, and it's like especially lately this summer, it's just become part of the fabric of America in a really remarkable way. It wasn't even like that. We're the same age, so you will probably remember this. Like growing up, it wasn't like that until like maybe the last 10 years or so that it really, really, really took hold as like part of the American cult. It became part of like the folklore of America.
Yeah, we're relatively country by old world standards. We don't have a lot of the rich folklore tales like a lot of like countries in Europe and Asia do. So Bigfoot is one of our genuine folk legends.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like I just did a story today about Oregon has like Bigfoot on a scratch ticket, and a school in like Pennsylvania or something decided they want the new school. They're going to be the Yeti. So it's like this is just crazy how this is more culturally accepted and
I live in Oregon and it's everywhere. It's everywhere, and you often see the Patty walk silhouette. As one of the most prominent things you see around. So yeah, it's
So I am going to jump a little into this because
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. So they're going through the quiet years, then the movie hits, and what is this like a renaissance for these guys?
Oh yeah, this is huge. So after the film was shot, so DeHenden and Green, after they hear that Patterson made the film, they all meet up at in Yakima, Washington. Yeah, so I can tell you the exact date is October 22nd. So the film was shot on October 20th, a Friday. It was released in the newspaper the next morning on October 21st. Then on October 22nd, the whole fraternity meets up at Al DeAtley's house, who was Roger Patterson's brother-in-law in Yakima, Washington, and they screened the film for the first time. So that's when Green and Hen didn't see it. So 6 days later, they had the first public screening at the University of British Columbia, where some awesome scientists gather and they view it, and they have a public showing as well. So that was really the first time it was released to the public, was October 26th. Then they pull Ivan Sanderson back into it. And then Ivan Sanderson was the one who, in February of 1968, wrote the article about it in Argosy magazine.
Yeah.
And then make a long story short, from there, DeAtley and Patterson made a movie, a feature-length docudrama, focused on the Patterson film shown, and they showed it throughout theaters in the late 60s, early 70s, in a process called four-walling. That's what they did back in the day. And then Patterson died in 1972. And he really didn't see the Bigfoot really blew up in around 1974. So Patterson really missed out on and Ivan Sanderson died shortly after Patterson. So both Patterson and Ivan Sanderson's both missed out on Bigfoot becoming a household name throughout the country. They never got to experience it.
I want to go back to this meeting, because this is what amazes me. So who all is at this? Because I'm imagining fucking Renee DeHenden has to drop everything up in Canada and be like, I'm on my way. You filmed it. I'll be there on Friday. Is it like that kind of thing? They had to have dropped everything to go to wherever they screened the movie, right?
They dropped it immediately. So at the time, so what happened is after the film was shot, Patterson-Gimlin drove to Willow Creek. They spoke to a guy named Al Hodgson. Al Hodgson was the go-to guy in Willow Creek when it came to Bigfoot. He knew all the Bigfoot fraternity. All the guys coordinated with. So it was Hodgson who reached out to both DeHenden and Green. At the time, DeHenden was in San Francisco trying to sell images in the Blue Creek mountain tracks, the ones that brought Patterson-Gimlin to Bluff Creek that fall. So he came up from San Francisco, and then Green was in Harrison Hot Springs, where he lived in British Columbia. And he came down, and they all met at Al DeAtley's house. And again, Al DeAtley was Roger Patterson's brother-in-law, who kind of underwrote all of his inventions and expeditions.
And is Bob Titmus there?
Bob Titmus is not there. He was at the October 26th when they had the public screening at the University of British Columbia. Bob Titmus did come down for that, and then after that, Bob Titmus drove all the way to Bluff Creek, and he was the first guy. He was the first guy to actually look at the tracks. He didn't take any pictures of it, unfortunately, but he was the first guy. He made plaster cast of the tracks at Bluff Creek, so he was the first guy to really examine them.
See, that's smart. See, that's It's it's remarkable that no one. How long between when they made the movie did he go and get the cast?
It was shot on the 20th allegedly, and he was there on the 29th.
Right.
When and then a couple days later, then some other people end up. Actually, there's a guy named Lyle Laverty. They didn't discover this till about 20 years later. I think around the mid 70s, discovered this forest ranger named Lyle Laverty. He actually saw them the next day after reading about the paper and actually got some pictures of it. But this wasn't revealed till probably the mid 70s.
Well, what's interesting, if you want to entertain the hoax theory, is that not only would they have to have hoaxed the guy in the suit, but I find it hard to believe that the guy, there's no evidence of what the stomper would need, you know what I'm saying? They would need to also make the footprints.
I should point out an interesting thing is the tracks of the Patterson subject, what they call Patty. His tracks was not the double ball tracks. So John Green and him were really shocked when they saw the plaster cast. It was like, okay, you guys came down here because we told you, because we found thousands of the classic double ball tracks. So we thought for sure this animal that you shot was certainly the same one who left the thousands of tracks, but the tracks are totally different than the classic double ball tracks.
Very interesting. But yeah, so if you were gonna, because there's no fucking way that if it's a guy in a suit, that the guy in the suit is wearing whatever made the prints. Because it seems like if you're the stomping boards, the stomping boards are like snowshoes.
Well, that's an interesting point you make. So yeah, if they hoaxed it, that they would have made the tracks as separate from shooting the film. Right. There actually is, a lot of people don't know, there's actually a second film that was showed on October 26th. It's been lost to history. So after they shot the film, they put another roll of film in, and they shot images of the tracks. And apparently, there's footage of Bob Gimlin stomping and trying to make an impression. And the tragic thing that they are lost is that we could have seen where the trackway was and compared it to the film. Some people we do have some other images of the trackway, generally where they are, and some people argue that they don't align to where the subject walks in the film. So one could argue that perhaps Patterson knew that was the case, so he buried that second film, but we don't know.
Interesting. Yeah, well, the obvious question here I have for you then is how was it lost to history? How do you lose it? How do you lose that?
There are still frames. We've seen still frames from that footage. It did in fact exist because it was shown at the October 26th screening at UBC, and several people have wrote about it. But yeah, somehow at some point it's just been lost to time. Well, the original Patterson film is lost to time as well. We have his second generation copies of it.
Yeah, I would assume. You mean like the actual film reel? Yeah. Oh, yeah. I didn't even think of that, but yeah, I guess it makes kind of sense. It would have deteriorated and fallen to shit anyway. Although I assume once, I don't know how they must have known how to copy a movie even back then. So I presume once they had it, they were like preserved it somehow. That would be, yeah. It's a provocative film, that's for sure.
Oh, no doubt. Legendary.
Yeah. And I had never really thought about that point about the having to do a double hoax, essentially. So if it was, to me, that almost goes more in favor of it being real. But then the other side, it's like, I don't know. It's if it was a double hoax, they pulled off quite the caper.
Well, I think the conventional storyline that a skeptic would come up with was that they shot the film previously, perhaps a week or two. It was certainly shot in the fall because you see fall colors in the background. So it was shot earlier that fall. Then on October 20th, they came, or October 19th, they came just to simply to fake the tracks, then to go down to Willow Creek and to report it to the newspapers.
Yeah. And it was just these two dudes on the thing?
Yeah, it was Bob Gimlin and Roger Patterson. Again, they were there for about a week. There's heavily logging operations going on in Bluff Creek at the time, and yet there's no witnesses, no loggers that said they saw them that time, which is a bit damning to their testimony or their storyline. You think if they were there for a week on horseback, they certainly would have been spotted by some of the loggers working there, but they weren't.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that's a very compelling. That whole thing that's the kind of thing that's like ripe for a Netflix documentary, the Patterson-Gimlin film and what the deal is with it. It's very interesting. Now, obviously, that film, you've said, it was kind of like it was the transformative moment for this thing. Now, going back to the era covered in the Abominable Snowman of California, were there I'm trying to wrap my mind sort of around the frenzy that was going on at the time. They're finding the footprints. I asked you before, who people were starting to say they saw it, though, right?
Yeah. So after the 58, the picture of Jerry Kerr went viral on the Associated Press, which is kind of like the internet of the era for newspapers. Yeah. After that, you start hearing sightings, but still, it's predominantly tracks people were reporting.
Well, what I find interesting, and maybe I feel like we would both know this if this was the case, but is the Patterson-Gimlin film the first ever claimed photographic evidence of Bigfoot? Or was there anyone like during that 50s flap, if you will, who sent something to the newspapers like, look, dude, I got a picture of it? Like, is there anything, is there ever any photo, or let alone film? Like photo even of anything resembling Bigfoot prior to Patterson-Gimlin?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure if I ever thought. I know certainly there was tons that came right after the Patterson-Gimlin film, but yeah, as far as before, I'm sure there was nothing that really was reported on widely in the newspapers. As I've never really thought about. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing you wonder, like, if someone might stumble across someday, like searching through newspapers.com or something. Like, it's like, oh, so apparently someone in Idaho took a picture that they claim was Bigfoot back in 1920 or 1950, whatever, and people just kind of forgot about it after a week. But like I said, I feel like if there were, because you're absolutely, I mean, post Patterson-Gimlin, we're awash in Bigfoot. Yeah. It's really quite ironic because I'm really flummoxed by this. I'll have to ask Lauren Coleman. He'll probably know that. If there was anything predating that, because there's tons of like footprint photos. That was the big thing. Footprint photos, right? Footprint photos were and casts. Those were the two big things that really were. Yeah, made up the foundation of this legend, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Very interesting. Yeah. So, at what point, growing up, at what point in your journey did you come to the conclusion that a lot of this could have been like a folkloric fabrication?
Yeah, I thought that. I can't really recall the moment. I think I was a believer as a kid. Naturally, but I think as I got older, I became generally a skeptical person, generally by nature. So by extension, I just couldn't accept Bigfoot. Even like I said, I hope I'm wrong though, because that'd be pretty amazing if we did find some evidence or a body. I think it's the only way you could conclusively prove that Bigfoot is reality is with a physical specimen.
Absolutely. In this day and age, now with AI and shit, you can't even. You have to. Before people were like, and I get the argument like DNA and all this, and it's just like you gotta have a fucking Bigfoot, dead or alive. You know, preferably alive. Like this, I don't see why we can't capture it if it's out there. It's a very frustrating thing. I mean, I've been a Bigfoot fan all of my life since I was like in elementary school. So it's like I'm in the same camp. I want it to be real, but the older I get, I'm like, this fucking thing is, I don't know.
Well, the fascinating thing, if you put yourself from the perspective of people in the 1950s and 60s, it would make much. Perhaps I would have been a believer back in the 1950s and 60s, but now fast forward to half a century. Now everybody in the country has a high definition handheld camera in their hand 24/7. We explored all these mountains. It's hard to believe that there could be a population of giant apes living in these mountains behind my house, and no one can seem to capture one picture of one. Yeah.
It's very it's frustrating. It's maddening. It's given rise to a lot of paranormal Bigfoot theories, but
I think it's what you have to embrace. It's almost impossible to rationally explain how one couldn't be found or pictures. So people are kind of resorting to these more fanciful theories of like time warps and whatnot,
interdimensionals, and yeah. It's kind of like, you're answering an unknown with another unknown. It's a difficult proposition to sort of wrap your mind around. But I know you're not like a Bigfoot guy, so it's right. You're not. I think you mentioned that in the email. Richard connected us, and you're like, as long as he knows I'm not going to come on and talk about Bigfoot the way you think of Bigfoot.
Yeah. I'm not sure if you can really ascribe the word Bigfooter to me or not. I don't know if there's an official definition of Bigfooter. I'm certainly a Bigfoot researcher, but I'm not out there looking for evidence of Bigfoot.
I would call you a Bigfoot historian.
Yeah, I like that.
I think that's that would be how I class. You've taught me so much here tonight about the history of this that I didn't know. I only really kind of knew the characters. I've read some of the book, but it's people can't see it. It's monstrous.
It's a big one. It's a big one.
Yeah, I'll be honest, Dustin. I got
the interesting thing is I set out to write a book about the Patterson-Gimlin film. It ended up being so massive I had to break it up in 2 books. So this is actually just half of the book I wanted to write.
Well, I'm already eagerly anticipating the Patterson-Gimlin book.
Yeah, I mean that's really the main event. I mean, this classic period is fun, but a lot of people are like, yeah, this is cool, but what about the Patterson film? Like, oh, that's coming.
Yeah.
But I do think this era is really this classic period I do think is overlooked. I think just it in isolation is really fascinating as well. It's been overshadowed by the Patterson film, but maybe I'm contributing to bring it to light for some people.
Yeah, well, like I said, I feel like it would make a great Netflix series. Not just the deep dive into Patterson-Gimlin, but like a Madman type of thing about these an American, a Canadian, a German, and a British guy, and a Scottish American guy all coming together and having these interpersonal conflicts and feuds and.
The interesting thing is in the follow-up book now I'm working on, which again covers the 70s. It's the exact same cast of characters, the same guys throughout the whole story.
Yeah. Well, it's I'm interested in that. Yeah, that like as it was described, like the quiet years, like they're having the time of their life. They're getting paid by this fat cat down in Texas to live in the woods and look for Bigfoot full time for like 3 years plus. Then fucking the rug gets pulled out from under them and they all have to go on with their lives. And then all of a sudden it's like some fucking guy in California caught it on film. And then it's like, boom, it's like sequel. It does kind of work really, really well with the second book. Now, when do you? Well, let's answer that first. When do you think the second book's going to be coming out?
I think it'll be done. It'll be done this winter. The vast majority is done. Actually, I wrote a lot of it before I wrote this first book. Like I said, it was originally supposed to be one book, but it became apparent after a couple of years that there's no way I could include it all in one book, so I broke it up in 2. So after I wrote this book, I was hoping to have an October 20th release date for obvious reasons, but that sure as hell is not going to happen. So I think I might be done by the end of the year, if not end of the year, early next year.
And what has been, if any, the reaction from Bigfoot folks who have read the book?
Yeah, surprisingly, it's been. I thought I was going to be crucified for sure, being a skeptic. I try to, I was delicate in the way I treated it. I tried to be not get too provocative, but yeah, I do have a lot of friends within the Bigfoot community, and they really help promote it. I work with the Bluff Creek Project guys, so they helped me a lot when I wrote the book as far as promoting it once it came out. So I think they gave me some credibility. If it wasn't for them, it probably wouldn't have been as well received. But a lot of people have spoken well of it. I know Warren Coleman really loved the book. He said it was the best book of the Bigfoot book of the year. I believe he says the best in decades.
Oh, wow. So,
yeah.
Well, no less an authority than Lauren Coleman. That's
yeah. He's the man for sure. And there's no short of Bigfoot books, but like I said, I think mine is unique because again, when I started doing my research, I was just shocked that no one had ever written this book that I ended up writing. So that was my goal. It was a challenge, but I made it through.
Yeah, for sure. It's fantastic. Like I said, I've done most of it, but I was kind of like skipping around a little bit. And it's a very interesting style that it's written in. It's, I think you call it, do you call it speculative?
Literary nonfiction. So I try to, it's kind of like the literary equivalent to a docudrama. So it's basically, it's all, I mean, it's 90% nonfiction, but occasionally I throw in like a scene where there's dialogue. Yeah. But I was really particular about that. I know some people don't like that, the no nonsense types, but I was really careful on how I did that and most of the dialogue I used was actually things that those individuals actually said in a different context. So I took, extreme measures to be as accurate as possible, even though I am essentially making up this dialogue. Right.
It's an interesting stylistic choice. What made you do it that way?
I mean, I'm certainly not the first person to do it. I just thought there were just certain events that we know what happened. And I'm like, that would be so fascinating to be a fly on the wall and to really see what happened and what was said between these guys at the time. And that's why I thought, well, I'll just write it as literary nonfiction. Truman Capote, he was a guy who really made literary nonfiction popular. I'm not sure if you've heard of him. He wrote the book in the I got it behind me somewhere, but it was the book he wrote the event occurred in 1959. In True Blood, in Cold Blood. In Cold Blood's the name of the book, yeah. So that's what really made literary nonfiction. He called it a nonfiction novel. I always liked that phrase as well. So I thought I'd go with that approach, and to be consistent with the first book, I'm doing the same thing with the second. And future books, I doubt I will do that approach. But I like it though. It's a mixture of a nonfiction book and a novel. But it's accurate. It's accurate. I can say with a lot of confidence in terms of the accuracy of the book. It's the most accurate to date. And that's not because I'm a superior researcher. I think I have a lot of advantages that past researchers didn't have as far as access to, one, the internet, and two, just having access to all these newspaper articles. So all my dates, like for example, the dates in 1958, those are all correct. And basically all the writers in the past have absolutely gotten all the dates wrong. So despite the fact I do intersperse these scenes in there, you can rest assured that the information in the book is damn accurate. It's a great pains to make sure it was accurate.
I get the feeling that's the case. You seem very encyclopedic about these characters in this time period. So I'm trusting your trusting you with that. Go ahead.
I got documents from across, documents from museums. I spent a lot of money, a lot of time digging up a lot of this documentation, letters. Fortunately, a lot of these guys have collections. For example, Ivan Sanderson has his entire collection in Philadelphia. John Green has a collection. Tom Slick and has a collection in the University of Texas at San Antonio. So I got all, and I was able to interview some people who were associated with it. So I dug up a tremendous amount of material. Andrew Gonzalez also has his collections at Humboldt State University. So I dug up a lot of stuff. I found some pretty amazing stuff that I don't believe anybody else has ever written about before. I know they haven't because I've read every book.
I like that attitude. Now, one of the challenges, let's say, is of being a Bigfoot historian, especially you're going into now the Patterson-Gimlin era. You're going to run out of runway on Bigfoot. Have you considered some other topic? I know I don't want to compare you to Renee DeHinden, but you're focused on Bigfoot right now. But have you, you're a young guy, you're young like me, when you run through the course of Bigfoot, have you thought about a different sphere to look into? I mean, the Loch Ness Monster has a very rich history of characters and expeditions and connections.
My cryptozoology career will be over after this book. I love history generally. So I have ideas to write a lot of different history books. Bigfoot just so happened to be the first one. It was my intent just to write one book, but ended up being two. I might potentially write a third book about the Minnesota Iceman because I actually already wrote that for the second book, but it just doesn't fit. The book's too long. It doesn't fit anywhere. But in itself, that's a very fascinating story. So I might end up publishing a really short book about the Minnesota Iceman, but not sure.
But we'll after that, you're going to bid farewell to cryptozoology. That's very that's very interesting. I believe you, because it seems like you're not really, I say this as a compliment almost, you're not a part of the Bigfoot community. So it's like you're kind of on the periphery. You don't have a website or anything. I was trying to. Yeah,
it's been a concern of me that, I'm writing a second Bigfoot, possibly a third Bigfoot story. It's like, kind of like an actor who gets typecast. Like, people will think I'm a guy who only writes books about Bigfoot. I only wrote one. I set out to write one book. It just ended up being so massive. It ended up splitting into two, possibly three. So we'll see.
Yeah. Well, that's like I said, a lot of people get mixed up in this. They don't get out. So I'm cheering for you.
I lose interest after 7. I love the 50s, 60s, and 70s are awesome. I totally lose interest in Bigfoot after. Once it goes mainstream, is when I kind of lose interest in it. I always say if it happened after 1979, I don't care. That's what I always say.
Well, that's kind of what I was alluding to also with sort of running out of runway, because like after Patterson-Gimlin, when we were growing up, we're same age again, like Bigfoot just wasn't, I don't know. Bigfoot it just didn't really have that. It was like a ghost or something. I don't know. It's hard to explain, but it's like you never really saw Bigfoot anywhere in pop culture, but every now and then you would see it a little bit, but it was like, I don't know. It's kind of just hard to explain, but people, it wasn't until the last 15 years or so that people started going out looking for it, as a pop culture.
Well, I think the internet changed so much. So I think the internet had a big impact on the interest in Bigfoot. But it was certainly pretty popular before that. But yeah, I mean, so many things changed, became more popular, with the advent of the internet, 25 years ago.
Yeah, that certainly seems to be the case. That would probably also explain, the change in Bigfoot, because it was definitely when I was a kid growing up, it was sort of like this weird elusive mystery, but it was like Bermuda Triangle thing. It was like it was like the thing that would always pop on the Unsolved Mysteries, and then you kind of go all of your life. There wasn't really much of a community for Bigfooting, for Bigfoot fandom back even in the 80s and 90s and shit, until the internet came along. Then people could connect and shit. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I'm really looking forward to this second book, and I really enjoy what you're doing. I've been really entertained tonight in this conversation about these classic Bigfoot people. It could be a movie. It really is there anyone we left off? Ivan Sanderson, I suppose. Is there anything we should know about him before we what was his? That'd
be a whole new episode, I think. Yeah, he was a fascinating guy, but he played a pivotal role. Like I said, he was the guy who wrote the article in 1959 about Jerry Crew introducing Bigfoot to the world, and he was the guy who introduced the Patterson-Gimlin film to the world in 1967, because he was it actually came out in February 1968. So. So he was a guy. Roger Patterson got into Bigfoot based on the 1959 article, and
so he was
he was his hero. He was kind of a hero to Roger Patterson, and Roger Patterson's book in 1966 included a lot of excerpts from all of these articles that Ivan Sanderson wrote, and he got Ivan Sanderson's permission. So when he shot the film in '67, he went to New York and to talk to. Naturally, he wanted Ivan Sanderson, the guy who introduced his film to the world, and that's what happened.
Whenever I think of Ivan Sanderson, I think of Brad Steiger when he was on this show 15 years ago, and he told the story when Brad Steiger was a kid. He was kind of getting interested in all this strange and unusual stuff. He wrote a letter to Ivan Sanderson, and Ivan Sanderson wrote him back, and he was like. It was the greatest thrill of his life. I remember just hearing the joy in his voice decades later when he recounted the story. It was it was, Every time when I hear Ivan Sanders, I hear his name in Brad Steiger's voice. He's like, I got a letter from Ivan T. Sanders.
Well, he's such a fascinating guy. I mean, I struggled. I think perhaps in hindsight, perhaps my biography on him is too long and may slow the story down in this book, but he's just such a fascinating guy. I was like, how can I not give this guy's bio? And it's amazing to me no one's ever written a biography on Ivan Sanderson, but it's yet to be done. There's a guy named Richard Gregonis who actually interviewed him when he was a kid, and he wrote a big biography up on him and is actually included on a website. He's never actually converted into a book. I think it'd be great if he did. But yeah, you don't get a more. All these guys are so fascinating, but perhaps Ivan Sanders is the most fascinating of all of them.
Yeah, well, that's the remarkable thing in a way. Like each one of these people could be a book in and of themselves. I wish there were more. I hounded Stan Friedman up until the last time we talked. It was like, you got to write a biography, dude. You got to write a memoir, man. You got to write an autobiography. But it never came about because some of these folks had some really interesting lives and remarkable experiences. And people can learn all about them. At least the classic Bigfoot folks in the Abominable Snowman of California. Dustin, I can't thank you enough, man. I've really enjoyed this conversation quite a bit.
Yeah, this was fun, Tim.
Fascinating and enlightening. And I like what you bring to the table here on this. I don't have too much an emotional investment in the 1950 Bigfoot thing, so it's like maybe it was a fucking big. I have one more. I'm about to let you go, but I keep coming up with things I wanted to ask you. But this did come up over the course of the conversation. I want to ask you. So Ray Wallace's family, they come forward in like 2002 or whatever when he dies. How long had they known that he was purportedly, allegedly, behind the Bigfoot footprints? Was it like a long-held family secret? Or was it like after he died, they were like looking around and they were like, oh, shit.
Yeah. I never interviewed. I attempted. I was unsuccessful in interviewing them. They never really made that clear. They kind of make it out like they just always knew it. But the interesting thing is, this is something that John Green pointed out, is Ray Wallace never claimed to have faked anything. So he was always a ardent Bigfoot believer to the day he died. But he was obviously known as a another fascinating guy. I'm not sure if you end up get to that part of the book. His biography is quite colorful. He's a quite colorful individual in himself, but very likable guy actually. But yeah, no, they never really made that clear. They never said that he actually said, yeah, I did in fact hoax these. And it's not clear to me whether or not they knew those stompers existed until after he died. That's also not clear.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. All right. Well, with all that said, thank you for indulging me as I sputter here to close out the show. Again, the book is The Abominable Snowman of California: Giant Footprints, Wooden Stompers, and the Making of an American Legend. You can find it on Amazon. Dustin does not have a website. So I don't know. Is there any way for people to contact you? Are you on Facebook or is there any place we can send people other than Amazon?
I am on Facebook. I think that's the only social media I really am engaged in. But yeah, I probably need to take up my game if I want to sell more books. So maybe I'll get a website.
There you go. Or you never know. It's like people could contact. Like, it's good to have a means of contact. Like, you never know. Someone might be like, hey, my grandpa was Ray Wallace's neighbor and he fucking whatever, you know what I mean? So who knows? There are people out there with stories and sometimes they want to tell them. And you've captured an amazing story here in the book. So with all that said, thank you very much, Dustin. It's been a real pleasure. And I look forward to getting you back on the show when the sequel comes out.
I'll be here.